This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, let's take this opportunity to give a special Yashar Kayach to Moshe Portnoy for tremendous avodah. Nobody even realizes how much work he puts in for every detail on the trip. He's probably up the whole night making sure that everything should run smoothly, and Baruch Hashem, we got out of here on time, and we're going to have a wonderful day together. This is our last day in Spain, so just want to cover really another amazing topic. Yesterday, we spoke about the Cherem, about not returning to Spain, and we mentioned that very likely there never was such a Cherem, but it was sort of self-understood. You don't come back to the country where they're either going to convert you or kill you. Today we're going to speak about another Cherem. This is a fascinating Cherem. Just to give you a little bit of the backdrop of historically what was taking place, you have to understand there was a major divide between two areas of Torah in Europe. You had the Balei HaTosfos in Germany and in France, and the climate there, the atmosphere there was very different than it was in Spain. In Germany and in France, it was more of a traditional approach where the Talmidei Chachamim focused only on Talmud Bavli. There was no studying other disciplines. Rashi, Tosfos, the Rashbam, Rabbeinu Tam, they sat and they learned Torah. They did not involve in other pursuits and other disciplines. However, Spain was more open-minded, more broad-minded, and many of the Gedolei Yisrael focused heavily not only on learning but also on philosophy, including, as we know, the Rambam. And that was one of the controversial points about the Rambam Sefer Moreh Nevuchim, where the Rabbanim of France, primarily northern France, were against the Rambam, but the Rishonim of southern France supported the Rambam more, with the exception of Rav Shlomo min Hahar and Rabbeinu Yoina. They actually vehemently opposed the Rambam. And the emphasis on philosophy became very troubling, specifically to a Rishon by the name of Reb Abba Mori Hayarchi. Reb Abba Mori Hayarchi. Now, what does the word Yoreach mean in Lashon HaKodesh? Yoreach means the moon. Yes, that's why. What? His name was Abba Mori Hayarchi. He was born in Lunel. Lunel, moon. Lunel comes from the moon. Even in English, right? The lunar calendar. Or, lahavdil, there's a word lunatic. What's pshat in a lunatic? He gets set off by the moon. He's a meshugana. People are considered connected to the moon. Somebody who's overly influenced by the moon. So he was called Abba Mori Hayarchi. He was from Lunel, France. And he compiled a work, a very important work. It's called Minchas Knais. Minchas Knais, which is a collection of letters that he wrote pleading to the Rashba. The Rashba was the leading personality in Spain in the 13th and 14th century. The Rashba was born in Barcelona in the year 1235. He passed away in the year 1310. We mentioned that the Rashba wrote more than 10,000 tshuvos. We only have about 3,000 tshuvos of the Rashba. The Rashba actually wrote more than 3,000 tshuvos. Interesting, the Rashba spent a few years as a financier. But when people recognized his godless and Torah, he was called upon to serve as the Rav of the community of Barcelona. And Rabbi Abba Mori Hayarchi petitioned the Rashba to write a Cherem against those who were studying philosophy. Now, I just came across something very interesting that I want to share with you. To us, it sounds strange. To us, we're very much on guard. When we hear that a Talmud Chacham is learning other disciplines, we don't necessarily swallow it so comfortably. But you have to understand, and this is what I'm going to share with you, Amar Makoim, a Davar Nifla, from one of the great Mikubalim. The name of this Mikubal is the Leshem, the Baal Leshem, Rav Shlomo Elyashiv, the grandfather of Rav Elyashiv. The Leshem was considered one of the greatest Mikubalim in the Litvische Welt. He wrote the Sifrei HaLeshem, Leshem Shavai V'Achlama, and he writes in the Sefer Hadeya a very important yediyah that many are not aware of. And this is a yediyah that the Avnei Nezer writes about, and others as well. And that is, the Gemara says, there's an area, there's a Miktsaya of Torah called Maisa Bereshis and Maisa Merkava. Well, says the Leshem, in the times of the Rishonim, this is a Yediyah Chashuva. In the times of the Rishonim, they never saw the Zohar. The Zohar had not been discovered yet. They didn't have the Zohar. So to them, to understand Ma'aseh Bereshis and understand Ma'aseh Merkava, they delved into philosophy, L'Shem Shamayim, in order to understand the workings of the Bria. But says the Leshem, now that Nizgale Lanu Sefer HaZohar, now it's clear to us that it's not necessary to venture out of the Torah to understand Brias HaOlam. Everything is in Torah Shebechsav, Torah Shebal Peh, and the Sifrei Kabbalah, the Sifrei Hazar, and the Sifrei Ari. But in this time, the Zohar had not been found yet. It's a Chiddush everybody should be aware of. Avnei Nezer writes in a certain sugya in Yevamis, a certain approach that Rashi and Tosfos take. Says Avnei Nezer, the only reason Rashi and Tosfos learn the sugya a certain way is Le'nizgal Elohem Sefer HaZohar. But if they would have seen the Zohar, they would have learned the sugya differently. Let me veer off just an interesting topic. I wasn't planning on speaking about this. I'm sure everyone on this bus will be able to fill in the blank. Kol hakoyes ki'ilu oived avodah zara. Anyone who gets angry, it's as if they serve idols. Marv Rabbi said, where does it say that? I'm sure most people would say, oh, it must be somewhere in Shas. It does not appear anywhere in Shas. It says in Shas, Kol ha-meshaber kelim b'chamasoi. If you break kelim in your anger, yeh be'einecha ki'ilu oived avodah zara. But it doesn't say anyone who gets angry should be like they serve avodah zara. Look in the Rambam, in Hilchos Deos, Kol ha-koyes ki'ilu oived avodah zara. Where'd the Rambam get it from? The Zohar HaKadosh writes, Kol ha-koyes ki'ilu oived avodah zara. Did the Rambam see the Zohar? It says in the Igeres HaRamban. Okay, maybe it also says in the Igeres HaRamban. The Rambam says the words, the Kol ha-koyes ki'ilu avodah zara. It does not appear in Shas. It does not appear in Shas. So Rav Yosef writes, either the Rambam had access to manuscripts that later were the Zohar, or the Rambam was mechavein me'elav to the words of the Zohar. And Rav Avadia brings many instances where the Rambam says things that are only in the Zohar, and the Rambam didn't have the Zohar. It's a very interesting topic. But the Rashba gets this letter from Rabbi Abba Mori Hayarchi, and Rabbi Mori Hayarchi says we got to do something about the fact that so many people are learning philosophy. Now, if you look in the Tshuvas of the Rashba, I'll tell you, on your sheets you have it in Tshuva Siman Taf Yudalid, Siman Taf Tesvav, Siman Taf Tezayin, Siman Taf Yud Zayin. The Rashba wrote a Cherem, and he was the chief signer of the Cherem in the year 1306 against learning philosophy. But I just want to point out a Davar Nifla, that the Rashba writes that if it just would have ended with the learning of philosophy, it would have been a halbatzara. It would have been a halbatzara. But where did the philosophy take them? He says something very interesting. That they started reinterpreting the psukim of Chumash allegorically. Instead of learning the psukim literally, they started learning that the Torah was just parable. So for instance, Avraham and Sarah, Avraham represents chaymer, raw material, and Sarah represents tzura, the final product. They started learning that there were never 12 Shvatim. The 12 Shvatim just represent the 12 Mazalos. And Amalek is the Yetzer Hara, and Lot is Seichel, and his wife is Chaymer, that's why she turned into salt. And the Rashba writes that what led them to interpret the Psukim so differently than tradition was the fact that they were being led away by learning philosophy. The Rashba writes in Siman Kuf Tezayin, number 3 on your sheets, that Af ba'avoseinu hakadoshim shilchu l'shaynam. In other words, they've violated, they've misinterpreted the meaning of our Avos HaKadoshim. Avraham and Sarah, they interpret to be Chaymer and Surah. They say, they interpreted that the Kalim of the Mikdash were not literal, that the Kalim of the Mikdash were scientific tools. For example, they said that the Urim V'Tumim was the astrolabe, which was one of the tools of the ancients. And they learned that the war of the 4 kings and the 5 kings was not literal. The 4 kings represent the 4 Yesodos: Eish, Mayim, Ruach, Afar. And the 5 kings represent the 5 Hergeshim. And then they learned that whatever is in Parshas Bereshis until Matan Torah, it's all a mashal. Well, the Rashba signed a Cherem against these people. And it's interesting, the Rashba was somewhat tolerant of this. The Rashba didn't write that you're not allowed to learn philosophy. I'll tell you what he wrote. He said one is in Cherem if they learn philosophy before the age of 25. Interesting. The Rashba did not forbid it entirely. And we'll see, the Rashba writes in the Minchas Kanois, and you have it on your sheets, you'll take a look at it. The Rashba says, these people think that I'm answering philosophy because I don't know anything about it. Says the Rashba, couldn't be further from the truth. I'm well acquainted with every concept of philosophy. It's just that if a person learns philosophy in their youth, and they're not grounded, Yesodei Torah, then it will lead them astray. But says the Rashba, first a person has to be Molei, Kreisai, Shasam Poskim, and at that point they have the Yesod, and then the philosophy, which is called in the Lashon Rishonim the maidservants. The main wife is the Torah. The cleaning ladies are the other disciplines of knowledge. And the Rashba said, I'm not going to forbid philosophy entirely, but one should not learn philosophy until they're 25. Now, don't make a mistake. The Rashba was not being liberal here. You have to realize back then, the age of 25 was like the age of 75 today. The life expectancy back then was about 30 years old. Okay, we're going to see an amazing thing. Back then, in the 13th century, if you lived to the age of 35, you were lucky. Now, it's not quite the way I'm saying it. It's not that most people would pass away by the age of 30, it's just Ruba never made it out of childhood. So those who did would often live a little bit longer. But the life expectancy, the age of 25, well, you've already been you've been around the block by the age of 25. And also another thing the Rashba said was this Cherem was only in effect for 50 years. For 50 years, because again, the halacha is you don't make a Cherem forever and ever, because you can't be moisef to the Torah, but you can make it as a specific measure, a one-time measure. Rabbi, I want to share with you an amazing historical fact. You know, we hear about all these charamim that they made, and we think to ourselves, oh, come on, did anybody listen to it? Like, hey, the Rabbanim got together the other year, and they forbid the internet. So, Lamaisa, did they have the koyach? Are people listening to that? You decide for yourself. But what koyach did the chachamim have back then? It's a mamish maval arayan. There's a tshuva in the Rush, and we're going to talk about the Rush. You have it on your sheets. I want to just bring to your attention, the Rush is found in number 17. As we mentioned, the Rush was born in Germany. He was Talmud Marami Rothenburg, but he had to escape. He had to escape to Spain. He comes to Toledo, and ultimately he becomes the Rav of Toledo with the help of the Rashba. And Maisa Shahaya Kachaya, listen to the story. There was a certain person in the community who blasphemed, who was Mekalel Asatzmai. He cursed the Chas v'Shalom the name of Hashem. And there's a tshuva to the Rush. Listen to this. The Bezdin in Spain had the koyach to give capital punishment. And they did. In Spain, the Rishonim used to give capital punishment. You say, how did they have the koyach to give capital punishment? Well, we mentioned that the two great Rishonim of the time in Spain were the Rashba and the Ra'ah. Let's talk a little bit about the Ra'ah. The Ra'ah was Rabbi Aaron Halevi. The Ra'ah wrote... What? Rabbeinu Yonah also. Rabbeinu Yonah, by the way, the Rashba was the Talmud of Rabbeinu Yonah. Let's talk a little bit about the Ra'ah. Let's talk about the Ra'ah. Rabbi Aaron Halevi of Gerona, Spain. Rabbi Aaron Halevi was also a Rav in Barcelona together with the Rashba, and both the Ra'ah and the Rashba were recognized by King Pedro. And the government of Spain authorized the Batei Dinim in Spain to give capital punishment, and they did. They did. And the question that was offered to the Rosh is, do you support the procedure of the Jewish courts to give capital punishment? And the Rosh says like this: in all my life, I never saw a Beis Din give capital punishment until I came to Spain. And I understand the government gives us authority to do that, but for a Beis Din to take away Nefesh MiYisrael, I don't support it, but I don't stop them. Why don't I stop them? Because it would be a Chilul Hashem, possibly, if we don't give capital punishment. Because all the Goyim, they give capital punishment when people violate their law. And if we don't treat our law as severe as the Goyim treat their law, it's a Chilul Hashem. So what happened was somebody publicly blasphemed Hashem, and the community was asking the Rosh, what should we do to this guy? If we don't kill him, it's going to be a Chilul Hashem, because the Goyim are going to say we don't respect our God. The Rosh said like this: if you want to kill him, I'm not going to stop you. But my eitzah is to have Rachmanos on him. What's the Rachmanos? Remove most of his tongue, cut it off, and this way we'll deal with him berachamim, and he'll be punished midah keneged midah. But we're not authorized to do that. Dina de Malchusa Dina, the Beis Din is authorized to do that. Says the Rosh, one thing is for sure, he won't do it again. One thing is for sure, and this is the psak of the Rosh and the Tshuvas HaRosh. So you have to understand, back then, if the Rishonim made a Cherem, they made business, not like today. If you violated the Cherem, the courts had full authority over your life. Let's talk a little bit about the Rashba for a moment. The Rashba was, as we mentioned, the chief rabbi in Barcelona. There's Beis Yosef in number 6 on your sheets. There's a halacha in Yerodea that a Jew is not supposed to eat pasakum. One should not eat the bread of a non-Jew. However, if it's a commercial baker, then there's certain dispensations. We're allowed to eat the bread of a commercialized non-Jewish baker. Paspalter. So now there's a machlokes between the Rosh and the Rashba. What if kosher bread is available? And some Rishonim say, well, if kosher bread is available, then you're not even allowed to have the bread of a commercialized non-Jewish baker. However, the Rashba says, even if it's available, but if you like the non-Jewish bread better, you're allowed to eat it. Comes the Tur, look at number 5, and the Tur says that in his opinion, the opinion of the Rashba is against the Yerushalmi. Okay, it seems like an honest question. The Rashba seems to be disagreeing with the Yerushalmi. Comes the Beis Yosef, and the Beis Yosef says the Tur stepped out of line by saying the Rashba is against Yerushalmi. What does that mean? Do you think the Rashba missed the Yerushalmi? Do you think the Rashba didn't know Yerushalmi? Says the Beis Yosef, Loi haya kosev kain. He should not have written this. Why? Man denehirin leishvilo dirakia. The Rashba, who all the highways and byways of the heavens were open, would never have missed a Yerushalmi. So we're not even allowed to say about the Rashba that he's against Yerushalmi. He never would have missed the Yerushalmi. What's very interesting, Rabbi say, is that part of this Cherem, part of the Cherem was that people started to be oiker, started to uproot the simple meaning of the psukim. But what's hafla of a fella, as we mentioned before, they started to say Abraham is Chomer and Sarah was Tzura. You ever hear of the Sefer Toldos Yaakov Yosef? Who wrote the Sefer Toldos Yaakov Yosef? Rabbi Yaakov Yosef Polonia, 1710 to 1784, the foremost disciple of the Baal Shem. He writes that Abraham and Sarah are a mashal. Look at number 7. The neshama, the tzura, is called Abraham. The guf is called Sarah. So the pshat that the Rosh and the Rashba put into Cherem is the entire foundation of Sifrei Chasidus. You hear Azazach? Hestamaisa. What the Rosh and the Rashba put into Cherem is the Yesoid of the Toldos Yaakov Yosef. Who else says this? The Tzrar Hamor, Rabbi Ram Saba, on this week's Parsha. Parsha's Chai Yisar, look at number 8. He quotes the Medrash Hanelam that the Parsha's Chai Yisara is Guf and Neshama, and Vatama Sara Zuha Guf, B'Kiryas Arba Hi Chevron are the Arba Yesoidos, Vayavai Avraham Zuha Neshama. So it's a pella. The Rosh and the Rashba put into Cherem those who understand Chumash like this, and this is the Yesoid of Sifrei Chasidus. And the explanation, there are two levels of explanation here. Firstly, what the Rosh and the Rashba put into Cherem, it's important to know this because if you're familiar with the Chuvas HaRashba, it seems like a lot of our Sfarim are going with a different Mahalach. First of all, the danger in the times of the Rosh and the Rashba, what were? That they were being oiker the psukim legamri min apshat, and that the psukim only mean chaymer and surah, and it's only a mashal, but the literal meaning is just a disguise, but it doesn't really mean that. Masha'in kain, our Svarim, Avada, there was an Avram Avinu and a Sari Imenu. Of course there were Yud Bei Shvatim. Of course there were Klei HaMikdash. But there are also deeper interpretations, and there are many levels and layers of interpretation. But the Rosh and the Rashba never meant that only the literal interpretation was true. But Rabbi say it goes more than this. You have to understand that Hakol L'fi Hazman B'Hamakoim. In the times of the Rosh and the Rashba, Greek philosophy was causing people to interpret the Torah in different ways, and it was diminishing their Avodas Hashem. It was taking them away from Shmiras HaTorah Mitzvahs. The Sifrei Chasidus was promoting and enhancing Avodas Hashem. Not every time something is in Cherem in one generation, is it not only not in Cherem in another generation, it doesn't even mean it's bad. It's Hakol, everybody has to know, it depends on the time, depends on the environment, it depends on the circumstance. Let me tell you just a few things about the Rosh. Firstly, when the Rosh came to Spain, it's a very unique phenomenon. You have an Ashkenazi rabbi as one of the chief rabbanim in Spain. And he was very well respected, Kemat as the Gadol Hadar here in Spain. However, when he tried to change some of the minhagim to minhagei Ashkenaz, that they didn't go with. You know, they said, we respect you greatly, you're our Gadol, you're our leader, but our minhagim are our minhagim. The Rosh, however, was not satisfied with certain practices that were taking place here in Spain. For instance, the study of Gemara was not focused on in Spain. In Spain, they focused on the Rif. And the Rosh said, it's not enough just to learn Piskei Halacha. It's not enough just to learn the bottom line. You have to be familiar with the Shaklavataria of the Sugyos. Because if you don't know the Lumdus, you don't know the back and forth, you don't know the reasoning and the rationale, then you can never extrapolate from one case to the next. So the Rosh was not in favor of the Derech HaLimud here in Spain, and also with those who paskin based on the Rambam. And the Rosh, in a tshuva, I want to refer you to number 23, it's Klal Lamed Aleph Ois Tes. The Rosh said that we cannot paskin straight from the Rambam. Why? The Rosh writes, very interesting lashon. The Rambam was different than all the other Rishonim. The Rambam never brings his Makaros. The Rambam never tells you where he gets something from. Says the Rosh, if you don't know Shas, then you can't learn the Rambam. Because you're going to make a mistake and say, oh, the Rambam says A, then we could apply it to B. But if you don't know the Rambam's Makar, you don't know the source, then you don't know how to extrapolate from the words of the Rambam properly. I want to tell you an interesting thing. We no longer have the kever of the Rosh. We don't know where it is. But there's a sefer called Avnei Zikaron. And to me it was very startling that the Rosh and his Rebbetzin not only are buried side by side, but there's a beautiful pasuk on their kever. And on the kever of the Rosh and the Rosh and his wife, it says, "Hanehavim b'chayehem u'v'moisam lo nefradu." Not necessarily something you would expect it to say on the kever of a Rishon. The Rosh is buried side by side with his wife, and the Sefer Avnei Zikaron brings Hanehavim b'chayehem u'v'moisam lo nefradu. And it's interesting, in the Igeres, in the Orches Chaim of the Rosh speaks about the kavod that one has to have for their wife. The Rosh says Never get angry at your wife. V'im b'smoiloi tidcha oisa, if you ever chas v'sham push her away, mekarev oisa b'yamina, you should always bring her close with your right side. So the Rosh was somebody who emphasized and stressed the inyan of Ava v'Achva b'nish l'ishtoi. So perhaps it's no wonder that the Rosh was zoicha to 8 sons who are all Talmidei Chachamim Muflagim. Not only the Balaturim, not only Rabbi Yaakov Torah, but his Mamala Makom was not the Torah. His Mamala Makom was Rabbeinu Yehuda. I want to end off telling you there are no words to describe this story, and it's not my story. This is a story that is recorded by the Chidah, and you have it on your sheet in number 25. It's a story recorded by the Chidah. The Chidah says, I found in the writing of Reb Chaim Vital. Okay, this is the Chidah quoting the handwritten document of Reb Chaim Vital, who Reb Chaim Vital writes he found the handwriting of the son of the Rosh, Rabbeinu Yehuda. And Rabbeinu Yehuda writes, I don't know so much about my family history. We had to flee Germany when I was very young. But let me tell you one tradition that I have about my Zayda. Who was Rabbeinu Yehuda's Zayda? Rabbeinu Yehuda was the son of Rabbeinu Asher, and the Rosh was Rabbeinu Asher ben Yechiel. So he writes a story about his Zayda. His Zayda was one of the Chachmei Ashkenaz. His Zayda was born in the year Tuf Kufa Ayin, the year 1210. And when Rabbeinu Yechiel was 16 years old, he had a chavrusa in the yeshiva named Rabbeinu Shlomo HaKohen. And Rabbeinu Yechiel, the father of the Rosh, and Rav Shlomo HaKohen, they made an agreement, they made a pact, they made a bris, that they made a deal. That whatever Rabbeinu Yechiel learns, he'll split with Rabbeinu Shlomo, and whatever Rabbeinu Shlomo learns, he'll split with Rabbeinu Yechiel. In other words, they decided they're going to divide all their mitzvahs, all their Torah. Now, if you remember, there's a minhag in Ashkenaz, there's a minhag in Germany, that Erev Yom Kippurim, you light candles, and you bring it to the shul. And they would treat those candles very seriously. And if the candle lit the whole Yom Kippurim, they took it as a siman tov. And if the candle blew out, it wasn't a good siman. And the candle of Rabbeinu Yechiel did not last through Yom Kippur. And he was very scared. And sure enough, a few days later, Chol Hamoed Sukkos, he passed away. Comes the Levaya, and the minhag in Ashkenaz was that before they would bury the mess, they would lay the mess out on a bed and straighten out his limbs. Maybe he won't be comfortable if the elbow is in a bad position. They would make sure the mess is comfortable. That was the minhag in Ashkenaz. I remember in my first shul, it was more like an old-time, one of the first Orthodox shuls in Queens. There are a lot of old people in the shul. So Baruch Hashem, now it's a young kehillah, but back then when I was starting in the job, there were a lot of levayas. So I remember I had to drive a few zakenim, about a bunch of alta yidinas in the back seat to a levaya. So they're talking about, where they would like to be buried, which cemetery they like. So one said to the other, I don't like this cemetery on the island. There's a highway there. It's very noisy, And the other one said, Rose, don't you know? When you're 6 feet under, you don't hear the cars on the highway. But anyway, in the minhag in Ashkenaz was that before they would put the mess into the kever, they would straighten out their limbs. And they're about to bury Rabbeinu Yechiel, the father of the Rosh. And Rabbeinu Shlomo, his chavrusa, comes and he starts crying, b'demoi shalosh, and he says, Yechiel, Yechiel, when you get to the Olam HaEmes, remember our deal. Remember that we split equally our Torah mitzvahs. We're upon b'fnei kol am va'eda. Rabbeinu Yechiel gives a wide grin and a wide smile, and he's mitzachek in front of kol am va'eda la'achar misasai. That's what the Reb Chaim Vital writes. The story doesn't end here. A few days after the death of Rabbeinu Yechiel, Rabbeinu Shlomo is learning in the Beis HaMedrash, and all of a sudden, who walks into the Beis HaMedrash? Rabbeinu Yechiel, the father of the Rosh. He says, "Was machst du? What's going on? How's everything in the Olam HaEmes?" He said, "Olam HaEmes, zeir geschmack. I'm in Gan Eden. Everything is wonderful." Says Rabbeinu Shlomo, I don't understand. Even Tanoim are not necessarily zoicha to come back b'chaya la'achar misasoi. He says, that's right. That's why I'm not going home. I don't want word to get out that I'm coming back. But you should know, in the Olam HaEmes, I have a very special place. It's an amazing thing. Rabbeinu Yechiel, the father of the Rosh, was zoicha to what Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was zoicha to. That he was able to come back la'achar misasoi. The story doesn't end here. One night, his wife is sleeping, and it was a Friday night, and his wife wakes up in the middle of the night, and she looks, and who's there? Her husband is there, Rabbeinu Yechiel, the father of the Rosh. And he says, my wife, get out of here. You should know that tomorrow morning the Goyim are going to wipe out the whole city, flee with all the kinderlach. I was mispalel and Shemayim, really they would have wiped out the entire region. But I was only zoicha to save the rest of Germany except for this city. So come, get out. And that night, the wife of Rabbeinu Yechiel takes all of her children, including the Rosh, and he was matzel his entire mishpacha. Just to give you a little glimpse of the Rosh, I just want to tell you that of all the Rishonim, we speak about the Rosh and the Rashba. Shashas HaKabbalah brings down the Rosh and the Rashba were together for approximately, we don't know, the Shashas HaKabbalah doesn't say for how long. It's brought down in the Psalm they were together for 8 days. When the Malach came to learn with the Beis Yosef, the Malach told the Beis Yosef about the Rosh. We mentioned this the first night. He said about the Rosh in Shamayim, Asher Kadishi. The Rabbeinu Asher is the holy Rishon. And he said about the Rashba, Rab Shloima Bechir Hashem. The Rashba is the chosen one of the Rebbe Shalom. So we're talking about Mamish luminaries. So we're zoicha to be in the same land that these great luminaries lived in, and their light continues on. Lenetzach netzachim. Shkoyach.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.